Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me for another tier list. Today we are going to be going through the discography of Electric Light Orchestra. ELO is undoubtedly one of the most important bands to come out of the 70s, and in my opinion, Jeff Lynne is one of the greatest and most innovative songwriters of all time. He really broadened the scope of what is capable within pop and rock music, from a songwriting as well as an instrumentation standpoint, and he was a true visionary that wasn't afraid to experiment and produced some of the most magical sounds we could ever hear from a rock group, and ELO's discography is loaded with so many great albums and countless classic hits that we all know and love, and they are a band that I cannot say enough good things about. So I'm very excited to be covering them for today's episode, and what I'm going to do is go through their 14 studio albums, starting with the Electric Light Orchestra and going up to From Out of Nowhere, and I will score each of them on this tier list, with S being the highest and D being the lowest, and I'll talk a little bit about each album, let you know my thoughts, and we will see where we end up. And please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree and how you would rank these 14 albums. I would love to hear your thoughts. Okay, I think that covers it. Let's jump right into it. Okay, we will start out with their debut studio album from 1971 titled The Electric Light Orchestra, and I will give this one a B. I appreciate this album for what it is, and it does have some great moments, but in the grand scheme of their discography, I wouldn't say that this is one of their strongest releases. The initial lineup of this group was comprised of 3 members who had also all been members of a group called The Move at the time, and it consisted of Jeff Lynne, Roy Wood, and Bev Bevan, and while The Move was more of a rock group, they had wanted to go into more of an experimental and symphonic direction, combining rock with classical instrumentations like strings and woodwinds, producing this interesting fusion of Baroque rock and progressive rock. We have 9 tracks, and the songwriting is split pretty evenly, with Jeff Lynne writing 5 songs and Roy Wood writing 4, and Roy Wood would only be present for the first 2 albums, and because of the presence of Roy Wood and the fact that they were experimenting and trying to find their sound throughout this early period, this album, as well as the 2 albums that follow it, I would say do sound much different from the ELO sound of 1974 and onward, and there are definitely some great moments throughout this album, but as an overall record, I think it is clear that they were trying out a lot of different things at this point, and I do think that the writing styles from track to track can be kind of scattered, and I also wouldn't say that every single song on here is a super strong and classic ELO song, but in the midst of that, there are still some very enjoyable moments, like the opening track, which is Jeff Lynne's 10538 Overture, a very cool and hard-hitting way to bring the album in. I love the prevalence of the cello throughout the track, a really great way to hit the listener with this very unique new sound, and great arranging with the way they combine the cellos with the electric guitar, and certainly a song that is a precursor to all of the amazing orchestral sounds that Jeff Lynne is going to continue to experiment with. I also really enjoy Look at Me Now, and I would say that that's my favorite Roy Wood song of the few songs that he did contribute to ELO. I really love the stripped down instrumentation using only strings and woodwinds. Between the vibe and the instrumentation of this track, I've always considered this song to be sort of like ELO's version of Eleanor Rigby. It's always given me that similar sort of vibe. Another great track on here is Mr. Radio. To me, this is the one song on here that sounds the closest to the ELO sound from 1974 and onward, and this would be one of the standout tracks from this album for me. I also think Manhattan Rumble is a super cool instrumental, a very dark and ominous mood with a really aggressive melody, and combining that with the very cool instrumentation creates this really haunting vibe that I love so much. So I do tend to gravitate more towards the Jeff Lynne songs on here, but I do think that Look at Me Now and the closing track, Whisper in the Night, are both very enjoyable songs as well. I would say that those 5 tracks that I mentioned are the main highlights of this album for me, and the other tracks might have some enjoyable moments here and there, but none of them are ELO tracks that I find myself going back to very much, and there are definitely some moments throughout this album that do feel like a little bit of work to get through, but regardless of that, there is still a handful of very cool songs on here, and even if every song isn't great, they still clearly pushed the envelope and created some very new and unique sounds that would really change the trajectory of what you could do from an instrumentation standpoint with rock music. So not my favorite ELO album, but I do really appreciate it for what it is, and I do think it is okay, so I will give this one a B. Alright, next we have their second studio album from 1973 titled ELO 2, and I will give this one a C. Unfortunately, I do have a harder time with this album, and I do consider it to be a slight downgrade from the first release. This album only contains 5 songs, all on the longer side, with the shortest one being a little under 7 minutes in length. And Roy Wood would leave the group during the recording of this album to form the band Wizard, and he would only perform on 2 tracks, playing cello and bass, but he didn't write anything on here. So this would result in Jeff Lynne being in the driver's seat doing all of the songwriting himself, other than the one cover song on here. And stylistically, this features a continuation of what we heard on the first album, with the classical instrumentation mixed with electric instruments and fusing together Baroque rock and progressive rock. For me personally, I don't tend to resonate with a lot of this album. I do find some of the longer songs to go on for a bit long and start to drag, and even the cover of Roll Over Beethoven has never really done it for me. I know I'm probably in the minority with that opinion, because I know a lot of people really love that track, and I can appreciate it from a musical exploration standpoint and how unique of a fusion it is of so many different things, but for some reason as a song, it just never did anything for me, no matter how many times I listened to it. The 2 tracks on here that I do enjoy are Mama and Kioma. Those are the only 2 songs that really carry this album for me. Mama is really beautiful. That's by far my favorite song on here. I love the guitar parts and the vocal melodies. The strings underneath it add a really nice layer of sweetness to the track. And again, I think this is another song similar to Mr. Radio, where it's a very clear precursor to the types of pop songs that Jeff Lynne will continue to write in future releases. And then Kioma is more of a rocking song on the longer side, but it keeps things interesting and goes in all sorts of surprising directions with really full-sounding instrumentations. And while I do enjoy this song, at the same time, I also wouldn't say that it's a really memorable or standout ELO song in the grand scheme of things. But for this album, I would say it is one of the better tracks, and Mama would be the clear standout on here. But unfortunately, this is an album that I do find a bit challenging to get through. I don't resonate with a lot of the tracks on here, but it does have the 2 songs that I said I find enjoyable, and I would consider Mama to be the best song that they've written up to this point from the first 2 releases, so it does have that going for it, but not one of their better albums in my opinion. I will give this one a C. Alright, moving on to their 3rd studio album, also from 1973, titled On the Third Day, and I will give this one a B. I think this album is pretty good, but still not one of their best releases. I do like it slightly more than the first album, and I definitely think it's an upgrade from their second release. I would say that this album does get us closer to establishing that classic ELO pop rock sound, but it still very much has those progressive rock elements that we got from the first 2 releases. But at the same time, it does start introducing some styles that I think do differentiate itself from the first 2 albums, and you can hear moments throughout some of these tracks that are a clear precursor to that classic ELO sound that we would get on future releases. The album consists of 9 tracks, with some of the songs being leftovers from the ELO 2 sessions, and I do think that there are some songs on here that are very enjoyable. I think side 1 is pretty good, definitely some heavy prog elements throughout, and Showdown would be by far my favorite ELO song from their discography up to this point, and it's also a track that would make my list of top 10 favorite ELO songs. Such a solid song, and it was also the hit single off of this album, not surprising. As far as the other songs go, I generally enjoy almost all of them. Really, the only song on here that I would say is a skip over track for me is Ma Ma Belle. I think having more of a rock and roll track on this can feel a little out of place in comparison to everything else on here, but in general, I think this album is pretty good, but not amazing, and although I do enjoy most of the songs on here, I would say that with the exception of Showdown and Bluebird is Dead, I wouldn't say any of the other tracks on here are really exceptional standout songs, and I do need to be in a particular mood to listen to this album, and I don't find myself going back to it as much as a lot of their other releases, and I think a lot of that just has to do with the more progressive side of ELO and how much you resonate with it, and I typically need to be in the right mood to listen to that side of their sound. But of the 3 albums that they have released so far, I would say that this is the best one up to this point, and Showdown is by far the best track that they've written so far. So those are the 2 big things that I would say in this album's favor, but like I said, I wouldn't say it's one of their standout releases, but not a bad album, but not amazing either. So I will give this one a B. Okay, next we have their 4th studio album from 1974 titled El Dorado, and this one will get an S. Amazing album and a huge improvement from their first three releases, and a very important album to establish a great trajectory for them to continue to flourish off of on future releases. This album still contains a lot of those progressive elements, but it also veers into a more poppy direction, creating this amazing prog pop sort of hybrid. And this would also be the first album where Jeff Lynne would hire an orchestra, and I think this was a game changer for the new types of sounds that Jeff Lynne was able to produce moving forward. This is also a concept album about a character who goes into these different fantasy worlds through his dreams to escape his boring reality, and we hear different themes that pop up throughout the album, and it's a very good album to listen to from front to back. It can be enjoyed as individual tracks as well, but I do find with this album I like to listen to it in its entirety. We have 10 tracks, and the songs weave in and out of one another beautifully, creating this really amazing journey of an album to listen to. My personal favorite tracks on here are Can't Get It Out of My Head, Mr. Kingdom, and Dorado Tornado. Can't Get It Out of My Head, I think, is one of Jeff Lynne's most beautiful ballads. Mr. Kingdom is a really underrated ELO track in my opinion, and I would say it's one of the unsung heroes from this album. Another great ballad that produces this really dreary sort of mood that I love so much. So yeah, I think this was a groundbreaking album for ELO. Jeff Lynne being able to really go all out with the string arrangements and see what kind of sounds he's capable of, as well as the experimentation with writing a concept album in a very effective and intriguing way, and it produced a lot of really great classic ELO tracks. So amazing album. This one gets an S. Alright, moving on, we have their fifth studio album from 1975 titled Face the Music, and this one will get an easy S. Absolutely amazing album, and this is actually my favorite ELO album. Some people might be surprised to hear that. I know this album is usually always held in high regard, but it typically seems to line up somewhere in people's top 5, but I don't see very many people putting it as their number 1, but for whatever reason, this one has always resonated with me the most out of every album from their discography. This one would continue on that similar trajectory that they established on El Dorado with the orchestral rock, but it also veers off and takes a slightly more pop rock direction on certain tracks, and also still contains some slight progressive elements in a couple of tracks as well. So we get a lot of stylistic variety from song to song, but I think it's packaged in a very enjoyable and cohesive manner. The album has 8 songs with 4 on each side, and I think from front to back it's incredibly consistent, delivering us one amazing track after the next. Side 1 gives us a nice blend of a little bit of everything, opening up with the amazing instrumental Fire on High, which definitely has some of those progressive elements that we got on the earlier albums, with the really adventurous songwriting and stylistic changes from section to section. And then that's followed up with 3 back-to-back incredible songs, Waterfall, Evil Woman, and Night Rider. I know most people's favorite track from side 1 is probably Evil Woman, but mine is actually Night Rider. I think the vocal melodies are so beautiful and catchy, and the instrumentation is so tasteful. And then side 2 delivers us 4 more awesome tracks, opening up with the energetic and hard-hitting Poker, another one that has some more progressive elements to it, and then they follow that up with my favorite song from this album, and another one that makes my top 10 ELO songs, Strange Magic. Just a perfect song with great chord movements, great contrasting sections, and beautiful vocal melodies. And then the album concludes with 2 more awesome tracks with Down Home Town and One Summer Dream, songs that have a great contrasting energy, with Down Home Town being more energetic and One Summer Dream wrapping the album up on a more mellow and chill vibe. So I don't have a bad thing to say about this album. Every track is great. It's got a great blend of all of the different styles that ELO has to offer up to this point, and I would consider the majority of this album to be really exceptional ELO tracks, with songs like Waterfall, Evil Woman, Night Rider, and Strange Magic. So an incredible album, my favorite ELO album. This one gets an S. Alright, next we have their 6th studio album from 1976 titled A New World Record, and this one will also get an S. Another incredible album, and this would be my second favorite ELO album. This is a very important album for them, and it resulted in a lot of exciting things. It was their first album cover to feature that classic ELO logo, and it was also their first top 10 album in the UK, and it also produced 3 top 20 Billboard hits. So this was certainly a breakthrough album for them, and I think it is well deserved. It has 9 songs, and it continues that same style that was established on the previous 2 albums, with shorter tracks that feature a great blend of pop, rock and roll, orchestral rock, and some progressive pop as well. I think this album has a great momentum to it. From one track to the next, we're hit with so much amazing music and lush instrumentations with the string sections, the backing vocals, as well as all sorts of amazing synth sounds being utilized. There's a tasteful blending of different styles from song to song, and again, a further evolution of Jeff Lynne's very exotic songwriting style. I enjoy every track on here, but my personal favorites would have to be Telephone Line, Livin' Thing, Tightrope, and So Fine. Telephone Line and Livin' Thing in particular, I think are really exceptional tracks and would both make my list of top 10 favorite ELO songs. So I don't have a bad thing to say about this album. I think this was just an explosion of creativity on Jeff Lynne's part, and I think he's really been on a roll with these past couple of albums, and it resulted in just another amazing release that has some of the most classic ELO tracks of all time. So an incredible album, my second favorite ELO album. This one gets an S. Moving on, we have their 7th studio album from 1977, a double album titled Out of the Blue, and this one will also get an S. Another incredible album, and this is my third favorite ELO album. And for a double album with 17 tracks, it is so consistent and produced a really incredible batch of new ELO songs, and it really seems like this album, again, was just a creative explosion from Jeff Lynne. And believe it or not, he actually wrote this whole album in 3.5 weeks, which I can't even wrap my head around that. Again, we're in a similar stylistic territory to the previous couple of albums with the pop and art rock tracks, with orchestral backdrops, utilizing the string sections as well as all sorts of exotic synth sounds. Since it's a double album, we have 4 sides of music, and each side is amazing and unique in its own regard, delivering us another handful of classic ELO hits, throwing in a couple of instrumentals here and there. And side 3 is actually a 4-song concerto themed around the weather, titled Concerto for a Rainy Day. As far as my favorite tracks from each side go, for side 1, I love Turn to Stone and It's Over. Turn to Stone is my favorite opening track of any ELO album. Such an amazing song, and I would say it's my favorite song from the album as well. For side 2, my favorites are Starlight and Steppin' Out. On side 3, I love Big Wheels and obviously Mr. Blue Sky. Those would be my other 2 favorite tracks on this album. Big Wheels in particular, I think, is an exceptionally beautiful ballad. And for side 4, my 2 favorites are Sweet as the Night and the instrumental, The Whale. And I do find that for me personally, anytime I listen to a double album, because there are so many more songs, the likelihood of there being tracks that I dislike does become higher. But with this album, I would say that 95% of it is amazing, and that's a very hard thing to achieve with a double album. So very impressive. There is a song or two that I could do without. I'm not particularly crazy about the songs Jungle and Birmingham Blues, and those would be my only 2 critiques. But in the grand scheme of 17 songs, I wouldn't say it is the end of the world having 2 skip over tracks, and the remainder of the album is so incredibly strong with so many exceptional songs that it really doesn't take away from it very much for me, and still easily qualifies to be an S tier. So an incredible double album, a real creative explosion from Jeff Lynne that produced another amazing batch of art rock and pop rock tracks, and my third favorite ELO album. So this one gets an S. All right, next we have their 8th studio album from 1979 titled Discovery, and I will also give this one an S. I absolutely love this album, and this is one of the ELO albums that I think doesn't always get the credit that it deserves. I think every single song on here is awesome. This one still has that similar pop rock and progressive pop sound from the previous releases, but also starts incorporating some disco elements on certain tracks, which makes sense given that it's 1979 at this point. And I think Jeff wrote tracks that incorporated those disco elements very effectively and still sounded like it fit in with the ELO sound. We have 9 songs on here, and like I said, I think every song is great. For me, this album has no skip over tracks. I think from song to song, we have a really great pacing, and all of these songs still contain all of those elements that I love from the ELO songs on the albums that preceded it. My favorite track on here by far is The Diary of Horace Wimp. So Such a beautiful song, and another one that would make my top 10 favorite ELO song list. A couple of other favorites are Shine a Little Love, Last Train to London, Wishing, and Don't Bring Me Down, obviously. For this album, I think Wishing is the unsung hero. Absolutely amazing and underrated ELO song. But I know this album isn't everyone's cup of tea, and I do think that at this point in their discography, it is clear that their style is shifting a little bit, but at the same time, I still think it contains all of those core elements that I love about them, and I think they delivered another great album with very solid and consistent tracks. So I don't have a bad thing to say about this album. I love this one. It would probably actually go down as my fourth favorite ELO album, believe it or not. I know some people are going to be blown away that I'm putting it in front of Dorado, but I really think every song on here is just incredible. So another great release, another one that gets an S. Okay, next we have their 9th studio album from 1981 titled Time, and I will give this one an A. Very good album, and for me this was right on the cusp of getting an S, but I do like everything in S tier slightly more, and after listening to it more and thinking about it, for me personally it just felt more fitting to put it in A tier, and I'll get to my reasons why. But regardless, this is still a very cool and just very awesome album. This is another concept album, their second one, and it is about a guy that is taken from the 80s and transported to the year 2095, and he is faced with the confliction between embracing the technological advancements of that time, but also longing for the past. And in present day, I think this is actually a very relatable subject matter for anyone who grew up in the pre-cell phone era. And because of the subject matter, this one takes a detour from the orchestral rock and goes into a much more synth-heavy, electronic rock, synth-pop, new wave sort of direction with all sorts of exotic and experimental sounds going on, really giving this album a futuristic sort of sound. And for 1981, Jeff Lynne is really creating some innovative and groundbreaking sounds that sound far ahead of its time. This album has 13 tracks, and I honestly think the entirety of side 1 is perfect. I love every single song, and the different stylistic twists and turns it takes from song to song is very enjoyable. Setting it up with the prologue and then going into Twilight, which brings the album in with such a great energy and an awesome vibe. Then we have Yours Truly 2095, which is probably the most futuristic sounding song on the album and definitely a favorite of mine. So many unique and amazing sounds and textures going on throughout this song. Ticket to the Moon is also awesome, and I particularly love the dark vibe of the chorus. The Way Life's Meant to Be is probably the most pop rock track from side 1 and the track that most resembles previous ELO albums, and I do like that we get a couple of songs like that throughout this. And then Another Heartbreaks wraps up side 1 beautifully with a nice chill song that again has more of those futuristic and experimental vibes going on. So I really love side 1 in its entirety, and I think side 2 is great, but there are a couple of tracks that I don't find as exciting, and that is ultimately why I put it in A tier instead of S. I really enjoy the opening 2 tracks, Rain is Falling and From the End of the World. Again, a nice contrast with Rain is Falling sounding more like a traditional ELO track and From the End of the World being more futuristic sounding. I'm not super crazy about The Lights Go Down. That one has never done much for me, and I find the song kind of underwhelming in comparison to everything else that we've heard up to this point. I like Here Is the News, but at the same time, I wouldn't say it's a favorite track of mine on here. Nothing really standout or exceptional about it. 21st Century Man is a beautiful track and would be my favorite song from side 2. And then Hold On Tight would be my least favorite song from the album. I don't think that this track really adds anything to the album, and I just find it more boring than everything else on here. However, I do love the way the album wraps up with the epilogue. Perfect closer with cool instrumentation and beautiful vocal melodies. And as you can see, I do think like 85 to 90% of this album is spotless, especially on side 1. But those 2 tracks on side 2 do take away from the momentum of the second half of the album a little bit for me, and that is ultimately why I put it in A tier. But regardless of that, like I said, it was right on the cusp of getting an S, and it's a really amazing album that was very ahead of its time for 1981, and it features some truly incredible sounds and textures and great ELO songs that I go back to very often. So a great album. I will give this an A. All right, next we have their 10th studio album from 1983 titled Secret Messages, and I will give this a B. This is an album that I have a lot of conflicting thoughts about because there are a couple of songs on here that I absolutely love, and I would say about 70 to 75% of this album is very good, but it definitely has a few tracks that I think are skip overs and unfortunately really kill some of the momentum. I will say that the opening song, the title track, Secret Messages, is definitely my favorite ELO song of the 80s, a super powerful and vibey song that brings the album in the most satisfying way possible. And other than Turn to Stone from Out of the Blue, this would go down as my second favorite opening track from any ELO album. And I actually think the remainder of side 1 is very good. Loser Gone Wild, Bluebird, and Take Me On and On are all very cool tracks. I love the different types of synth sounds that are getting utilized. And I think that this album still contains tastes of those really experimental sounds that we heard from the previous release. Once we get to side 2, that is where the album starts to lose a little bit of steam for me. Obviously, I love Four Little Diamonds, and I think Stranger is a solid song. I'm not a huge fan of Danger Ahead, Train of Gold, and Rock and Roll is King, and those would be the 3 songs that really take away from this album and from side 2 for me. Letter from Spain is fine. Not a favorite of mine, but I wouldn't say it's a bad song, not a skip over. But as you can see, I do think that the high point of this album are the opening 4 tracks. I don't have any issues with side 1, and all of my favorite tracks happen on that side. And then for side 2, I really could do without like half of the songs on there, and that's the main thing that takes away from this album for me. So I would say this is an okay record that has some really great moments, but in its entirety, I do find it a little underwhelming, but at the same time, I wouldn't say it's one of their worst albums. And like I said, it does contain my favorite ELO song of the 80s with the title track, which is something very positive about it. So an okay album, I will give this one a B. Okay, moving on, we have their 11th studio album from 1986 titled Balance of Power, and I will give this one a B as well. Pretty good album. I will say that I don't dislike this album as much as a lot of other people do. I notice a lot of people do rank this one as one of their least favorite ELO records, and I do think that this is a little bit better than some people give it credit for, but at the same time, certainly not one of their most standout or exceptional releases. Stylistically, this one takes a detour into more of that soft rock and synth pop sort of style, so I could understand why this shift wouldn't resonate with every ELO fan. But for what it is, I still think they managed to produce some really great tracks throughout this. We have 10 songs on here, and similar to what I said with Secret Messages, I actually think that side 1 of this is very strong. I enjoy all 5 songs on here, and I think the pacing from track to track is very effectively placed. My favorite song from side 1 would be the opener, Heaven Only Knows, a really great way to kick off the album and a really solid and energetic pop rock track. I do think that side 2 gets a little worse and does have a couple of tracks that I'm not crazy about, like Sorrow About to Fall, Endless Lies, and Send It, but it also has Calling America, which was one of the singles for this album and a great song, and it also has my personal favorite track from this album, Without Someone. I think that song is so beautiful and has a particularly powerful and emotional chorus. So I wouldn't say any of these tracks go down as like my favorite ELO songs, but I still really enjoy a good chunk of this album and don't mind this stylistic change that they went into. And unfortunately, after the release of this album, ELO would break up and we wouldn't hear from them for 15 years. So not one of their best releases, but definitely not their worst either. And I do think, like I said, it is a little bit better than some people give it credit for. So I will give this one a B. Okay, next we have their 12th studio album from 2001 titled Zoom, and I will give this one a B. Another album that I would say is good, but not amazing. This was the first new album since Balance of Power with a 15-year gap in between, and this is their first release to not feature Bev Bevan, who had been on every ELO album up to this point. So the only original member is Jeff Lynne, and the rest is comprised of guest features, and it actually features guest appearances from both George Harrison and Ringo Starr. We have 13 tracks on here, and I do think that there are some really amazing songs throughout this, with tracks like Moment in Paradise, which is by far my favorite song on here. Some others that I find very enjoyable are All Right, Just for Love, Stranger on a Quiet Street, It Really Doesn't Matter, Ordinary Dream, A Long Time Gone, and Lonesome Lullaby. And although I do enjoy a large chunk of this album, it still does have a handful of songs that I don't think really add anything to it and only take away from the momentum, with tracks like State of Mind, In My Own Time, Easy Money, Melting in the Sun, and All She Wanted. And I do think that if this album had just been a little bit shorter and condensed down to maybe 9 or 10 tracks, I would have thought that the good songs on here are strong enough to justify putting it in A tier, because there are certainly some amazing tracks on this. But I think the 5 songs that I'm not crazy about, combined with the album being a tad too long, does bump it down a bit for me, unfortunately. So not one of their best albums, but not terrible for what it is, and it does have some amazing tracks throughout. So I will give this a B. Okay, next we have their 13th studio album from 2015, titled Alone in the Universe, and I will give this one a B. I would say that this album is okay, but in the grand scheme of the ELO discography, I wouldn't say that it's anything exceptional. Again, we have a long gap between albums. This was their first release in almost 15 years, so naturally people are going to wonder what sort of direction the album is going to take. And as far as the sound goes, it still definitely has that ELO sound, but obviously with the changes in technology, there's going to be some differences in the sound and the production, but it doesn't sound like a completely different group or anything like that. And I think Jeff Lynne's vocals have aged very well. I would say he is one of the very few artists whose voice sounds like it's changed very little since the 70s, and that's a very impressive thing. As far as the music on here goes, we have 10 tracks, and I generally enjoy the majority of the songs on here, but at the same time, I don't think a lot of the songs on here are really exceptional or standout tracks, especially in comparison to a lot of their other material. For me, there are 4 tracks that tend to stand out on here, with When I Was a Boy, When the Night Comes, The Sun Will Shine on You, and I'm Leaving You, with my favorite being The Sun Will Shine on You. I think that song is really beautiful, and really the only song that I dislike on here is Love and Rain. But other than that, I have general good feelings about the remainder of the tracks on here, but like I said, they're good songs, but they aren't amazing ELO songs that I find myself going back to a lot. So all in all, I think this album is pretty good, but not great, and for having such a long break in between releases, they still managed to put out an album that sounds like ELO and has a couple of tracks that I find very enjoyable. So an okay album. I will also give this one a B. Okay, and lastly, we have their 14th and most recent studio album from 2019, titled From Out of Nowhere. And unfortunately, I'm going to give this one a C. Not a great album, and I would say it is a downgrade from Alone in the Universe. In general, I would say it takes on a very similar sound to the previous release, but I do think the quality of the songs isn't as strong, and this one has much more skip-over tracks for me than almost any other ELO album. I find a lot of these songs pretty boring, generic, and flat-sounding, and the tracks that I do enjoy are sandwiched in between a lot of lesser exciting songs, and it really affects the momentum of the album for me. A couple of good things that I will say about this album: I think the opening track, From Out of Nowhere, is absolutely amazing and is easily my favorite song on here, and I actually think it's an even stronger opener than When I Was a Boy from the previous release, believe it or not. And when I first heard this album and I heard this as the opening song, I really went in with very high expectations, and unfortunately that died down really quickly after this song. Other than this track, the only other songs that I really enjoy are Down Came the Rain and Losing You. I also think the closing track, Songbird, is okay, but nothing mind-blowing or exceptional either. And unfortunately, other than those 4 tracks, I do find the other 6 to be pretty underwhelming, and it pains me not to have better things to say about the most recent album, but no matter how many times I listen to it, it just never grows on me. I've really tried. But regardless of that, it does have 3 songs that I would say are very enjoyable, and I'm happy that we are still able to get some good tracks out of them. But in the grand scheme of the ELO discography, unfortunately, I think this is one of the most forgettable albums with the least amount of high points than just about any of their other releases, and this is actually my least favorite ELO album, unfortunately. So I wish I had better things to say about this, but I do find this album pretty disappointing. This one will get a C. All right, we did it. We went through their 14 studio albums, and this is where I ended up. Such an awesome discography with so many classic hits and a really fascinating musical progression to watch unfold from 1970 all the way up to 2019. Such an incredible and important band that have left behind quite the legacy and really left their mark on rock music. So that is it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope it was enjoyable. I'm sure there will be plenty of agreement and disagreement on certain takes, and I would love to hear them. So please let me know your thoughts in the comments and let me know how you would rank these 14 albums. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you are interested, feel free to check out some of my other tier lists linked in the comments and the description and see if there's anything else that you might like. All right, I think that's about it. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you at the next video. Take care.